what is the best mode of delivery for these norms that you are trying to instill into your combatant membership or into the members of the armed forces. You've mentioned that we need to take into account different norms or different principles or ideas are going to be trained depending on the level of the who's the recipient or the target actor. You mentioned already that there's the mode of delivery is an important aspect of this. So that classroom education, and I like how you bifurcate this education versus training. Classroom education provides the baseline for understanding the principles, but it's not the same as training to it, and particularly training in a combat replicating scenario or combat type simulation. Sure. That reminds me from some of the research that we've done with the state armed forces and some of my conversations with the U.S. Army folks as well as part of my research is that surprisingly there's differences that we get across different state armed forces in how people receive different types of training or who's doing the training, and we'll talk about what is the importance of the actor who's doing the training, the person. But one thing that seems to be a constant is that soldiers tend to hate death by PowerPoint, so to speak. So they
yes,
I've sat in that briefing with the poor JAG having to go through all the the important principles that on the PowerPoint slide that's been handed down to him from generations past, to a room full of bored soldiers wondering how long before they can break to go to chow. But at the same time, we hear that actually in interviews from some of the discussions I've had with different soldiers, that they do like being exposed to the baseline of information. They think you can't really train to something until you've first learned about it. And so that's an essential, necessary, but not necessarily sufficient step towards adopting or understanding or implementing principles of IHL.
Yeah, I agree with that.
but it's that second step where really you need to go forward and train to it. So let me push you on that a little bit further in terms of you mentioned training and exercises is an essential part, and you noted you're part of the process for training at the senior level or at the brigade level, battalion level. What is the effectiveness of or I guess what's most effective for training the average Joe at the junior level, and how much does this need to be a part of his regular training? And is your sense that state armed forces around the world are doing is enough being done for doing that kind of training? What else can be done? What's an essential part of that training for that junior level soldier?
Yeah, great question. I completely agree with you on the PowerPoint, the death by PowerPoint. You need to establish a baseline, right? And it needs so you need to say, hey, look, there are these things called the Geneva Conventions. You need to know that, and you need to know that there's some stuff in there about what you're supposed to do and not do, right? You need to establish a baseline for soldiers. And so you don't want to dumb it down too much, right? You want to make sure they understand that there are rules, conventions that all nations agree to follow that apply to them. What I found that works best is, I hate PowerPoint, using PowerPoint like that, but I think sometimes it's helpful to have a picture up there, or maybe put a couple, the basic rules, the soldier rules, things that every soldier baseline need to know. But what I would suggest, and what I've seen work pretty well, is even if you have one of those briefings and you kind of get the information out there, is once you've done that, cut that part down and save some time to break into smaller groups, and maybe in the room, and do scenario-based, like vignette training. And so you've talked about the basics of LOAC, and maybe you're talking about hostile act, hostile intent, okay? And so you have a vignette that forces those soldiers to wrestle with, I know the JAG just said that, I was kind of listening. Is this a hostile act, hostile intent? Why and why not? And so the way to do that is you need people, obviously group leaders, who are able to facilitate that. And so maybe it's a train the trainer kind of thing, but beforehand. But I think you're right to say that it takes repetition. And so even though you've gotten that you've given that initial sort of overall training, and you've done some vignettes. Those are great, but you've got to do it in the same, it's like training to fight. So you got to do it in the same way that you're going to do it when you're actually fighting. And so you got to be walking on the ground, holding your weapon in a squad, and something happens, and you're trying to make those decisions, often very like split second kind of decisions, in a scenario that's more realistic. And so when you do deploy, you have muscle memory, right? You're able to actually to make those decisions on the fly and understand why you're making those decisions.
Fascinating. That's really interesting. I'll note that during our research for the Roots of Restraint report in Australia, we happened to do some of the same surveys and interviews at the Australians' somewhat equivalent of West Point, the Royal Military College Duntroon, which is their Army Officer Training Center, where they had put into place a really phenomenal, after noting some ethical issues that they had in the past, which was based on, the old death by PowerPoint type training, where they incorporated this type of, they had a capstone exercise for the graduation, and in which cadets were put through the ringer and put into simulated torture situations, simulated ethical dilemmas. And that really seemed to drive home to the cadets of what was important, and having experienced that in that stressed environment seems to have really made a difference for them. And I know, talking with Army officers who were downrange coming out of West Point, they said, boy, that West Point training, really just allowed me to, not that I was more ethical, so to speak, or a more moral person, but I was able to step into that unit and be the moral compass, because I'd already been thinking about these issues. West Point had already trained me to be have this perspective in the back of my mind. So it wasn't like I was learning particularly on the job.
It always comes back to leadership. It's the commander's job to set the train that needs to be done. The commander needs to say, this is important. There's that old adage that soldiers will do what commanders check. And so if you're emphasizing and re-emphasizing and put a priority on things like LOAC compliance when you're going into an operation, then that's going to be important to soldiers both in training and then when they deploy, because they know their commander is checking. Not that they're scared of being caught or do something wrong. It's that they know that it's important.
Yeah, interesting. That's a really nice addition to bring it home. It's easy sometimes looking at it from an academic perspective that these are the rules, and if you just train to the rules, everything should go smoothly. But from your perspective, seeing the operational aspect of LOAC being implemented on the ground, to note that at the end of the day, these are people, these are real soldiers, real combatants on the ground, being led by real actual commanders, people, personalities, and without that leader being there exhibiting leadership and making that a priority, it's the nature of warfare and the nature of human nature for people to sort of deviate from perhaps what they should be doing.
Another thing I think is trust, right? There has to be trust within units that, and I mean this on a number of different levels. One, the soldiers need to see that commanders and leaders are also following those rules. Not just that they're saying it's important, but that they themselves are following those rules too. If rumors will go through a unit if something happens, any kind of incident, bad or good, and so you want to make sure that soldiers have that level of trust that commanders are going to do the right thing themselves, and if something goes wrong, that the commanders are going to follow the rules when it comes to, hey, if there's a violation, we are going to investigate it. Doesn't mean you're immediately guilty or anything like that. You're gonna get due process. We're gonna go through the whole process, right? And mistakes happen in combat just like anything else, and so it's important that they have a level of trust with the command to understand that the rules are going to be followed, and that when it comes to them, that they're not going to be, trying to think of the right word here, that if they make a mistake, right, and it's not a something where they thought the person was about to shoot them, And it turns out under the heat of battle that it wasn't a weapon they were holding, right? And so they thought, oh, I had a hostile act. Someone turned towards me and I shot them. I'm going to get court-martialed now. Well, not necessarily, right? Because we're going to look at the circumstances, as you knew it at the time, and take that all into account. So a little level of trust, I think, is necessary. Other things that can be obstacles to the, I think we talked about a few of them earlier, as far as at least understanding, is that you have to be creative with the training and the education part itself, right? If you just do the 2-hour-long PowerPoint presentation, that will inhibit learning. Absolutely. There's no, especially if you don't follow up and kind of, give them some muscle memory on how to implement those things. So I think that's, you got to be creative with your training, and it's probably not something you want to do on a tarmac an hour before you're taking off, right? You may go through your ROE in that sort of scenario at the small level, but that's not your initial training. That should have happened a long time ago. So repetition over time, I think, is important on this.
The combat stress and things are a lot different, in the heat of battle. Obviously that changes the calculation somewhat. Things, I love how West Point trains that always, aim to choose the harder right over the easier wrong, which is such an important phrase, I think, for instilling ethics. And combat stress makes it so much easier in some ways to choose that easier wrong in some ways. In my research, we have this idea about, we call it the Combatants Trilemma, and I know you'll be very familiar with the fact that the soldiers are and all combats are trying to balance not only achieving the mission and protecting civilians, but also protecting their fellow forces or protecting themselves. And it's almost impossible in some ways to do all three perfectly, in a sense, because any one thing that you focus on is necessarily going to detract in some ways from the other two. And so I think it's helpful for us to understand it's not, these law violations don't always come from necessarily malign intentions or ill will. They're maybe for noble intentions of wanting to protect your troops or promote loyalty, promote a culture of unit coherence and cohesion. But taken to the wrong extension, they can then slip into unethical type behavior as well. So it breaks down this idea that these are good versus bad, very, all easy decisions to make on one side. Of course, very easy to avoid the negative decisions. And yet, I think in the reality, which I'm sure you've seen, has been, there's a lot of gray, and people are complicated, and it's about trying to make the best decisions in very difficult contexts.
That's a great analogy there. That I said before, leadership matters. You might summarize all of this conversation as character matters. Yes. And I think it very much does. We preach and we try to get leaders to care for their soldiers, deeply care for your soldiers. And so you're right. When something happens and a soldier makes a bad decision, there is this sense of loyalty in some ways. And you just sort of add to that when you're in a combat scenario, you're in a deployment sort of scenario. It sort of increases that pressure because that's your family. Those are the only folks you have. But even here, starting at West Point and a lot of the other academies, all the other academies, we have the honor code. And the reason why you have that, the reason why there's that toleration clause, right, where you don't tolerate those who do, cheat, lie, or steal, is you have to, that also has to become something like you understand that is the right thing to do. It'll find a way to work out in the end, right? That person still might get in trouble, but it's the right thing to do because there's a higher loyalty to, to your unit, your country, if you will. And that's something that just needs to be ingrained in soldiers. You mentioned that choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. The trouble with, I think, some of these scenarios is in war, in the fog of war, right? Things can gray a little bit. And so, I think soldiers and leaders even at times can get confused about, okay, what is the harder right or the easier wrong? So that's part of war, I think. What soldiers also need to understand, there's two things that we don't always talk about when it comes to compliance with LOAC and IHL. And those two are, number one, when soldiers follow the rules, right, and they don't follow, they don't break, commit violations, and commanders, hold those that do accountable. It lets soldiers come back whole, right? If you've gone to a deployment and you've done some things, even if you weren't caught doing it, that soldier's not going to, that's going to be a thing in the back of their mind for a very long time. Things that they may have been a part of, and so they're not coming back whole if they have committed those sort of violations. And so we want to ensure for their own good as well that we train them enough and make sure those things don't happen.